皆さん、こんばんは。同時通訳を聞くには、Zoom 画面右下の
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To hear the simultaneous interpreting, please select an audio channel by clicking the interpretation icon at the bottom right of the Zoom screen. This program is organized by ISIC Japan in association with Janes and produced by Bloom Pacific and Versatech. Sponsors, in alphabetical order, are BAE Systems, L3 Harris Technologies, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon Technologies. Interpreters are Yasuo Watanabe and Paul Hersey. I would now like to turn the floor over to former Special Advisor to Prime Minister Abe's cabinet, Dr. Taniguchi Tomohiko, to moderate this Defense Industry Forum on the topic of regional security.
日本では夜の9時を回ったところです。私、今宵のモデレーターを務めます谷口智彦と申します。今日はと言いますか、今晩もとても素晴らしいパネルが成り立ちました。ジェインズで長らくアジアの防衛環境、装備の
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have a wonderful panel too. Mr. John Gravatt is an expert among experts who's written so many articles. Welcome to you from James. Also, Kyosuke Matsumoto and Sugio Takahashi, as you can see on the screen. Mr. Matsumoto is responsible for policy on equipment. You could say that this is a very important headquarters for this kind of policy. And Mr. Takahashi has a lot of writing to his credit. And recently, he's been focusing on the defense environment and the defense industry and defense equipment and the status of defense equipment at NIDS. We have simultaneous interpreting service for you, so you'll be able to speak freely in English or Japanese, which I think is just just wonderful. Now, I believe Mr. Gravatt, you were first.
Thank you very much. My name is John Gravatt, and I am Principal Defense Industry Analyst with Janes. I'm focused on the Indo-Pacific. And my presentation today is about Japan's profile in the Indo-Pacific through defense exports. Since Japan lifted its self-imposed ban on military exports in 2014, Indo-Pacific sales have become a target for Tokyo, linked closely to Japan's regional security objectives. And the presentation I have for you today will assess some of Japan's opportunities in the Indo-Pacific in terms of defense exports, and also evaluate market entry strategies in the face of growing regional rivalry for defense export contracts. Next slide, please. To demonstrate the scope of Japan's opportunities in the Indo-Pacific, we have on this slide some data from Janes showing actual and forecast defense budgets for the region, for the Indo-Pacific. The key takeaway from these charts is that defense investment in the Indo-Pacific continues to rise quickly despite the impact of COVID-19. The charts that you can see show defense investment funding, which is spending on defense procurement and R&D, not on personnel or operations. The chart on the left shows that in 2021, total defense investment funding in the Indo-Pacific is about $136 billion. And that's a compound annual growth rate of 5% since 2011. Looking forward 10 years to 2030, regional defense investment is forecast to grow to nearly $200 billion, a compound annual growth rate of 4%. And this means that, as the chart on the right-hand side shows, this means that the Indo-Pacific will be the fastest growing defense investment region in the world over the coming decade. In the middle of the slide, you can see what regional countries are growing fastest. In terms of Japan accessible markets, several stand out. These include the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and Malaysia. These are countries that we call in Jane's some of the developing markets. And the next big question really is to why such strong growth? Well, there are two key factors really. One is the region's fundamentally strong economies, and two are the strategic drivers, including China and territorial disputes that are unlikely to diminish any time soon. Next slide, please. The next important thing I want to show you is market potential. This chart, again based on Jane's data, shows Indo-Pacific countries excluding China. The vertical axis shows the percent of defense investment growth over the coming decade. And the size of the country's flag should indicate the forecasted size of that country's defense investment during those years. The horizontal axis shows the percent of defense equipment that each regional country is forecast to import directly during that time period. And the term imported directly is important because what our data shows is that countries with smaller investment budgets tend to import directly. By contrast, the countries with the bigger defense investment budgets, including India and Australia, these countries tend to require local production. Another point here is that countries with smaller investment budgets are expected to slowly shift towards the left of this chart. These countries, these smaller countries, are increasing requirements and emphasis on local production over direct imports. And this trend is a result of COVID-19 and responses in regional governments to build locally and to create jobs. In other words, a bid to support self-reliance. And for Japan, as an aspiring defense exporter to the region, the implications are clear. It needs to be able to support local industrial engagement for it to be competitive. Next slide, please. This slide shows more Jane's data, this time focused on defense suppliers to the Indo-Pacific over the past decade. The data is focused on Japan accessible markets, so excluding South Korea and China. The key takeaway here is that the Indo-Pacific is the most diverse defense market in the world. At a top level, 2/3 of regional sales are attributed to just 3 suppliers, the United States, Russia, and China. The other 1/3 is competed for by around 30 other countries, including Japan. When the data is broken down, we see that the US completely dominates the developed markets in Oceania and Northeast Asia. But the real diversification is taking place in the developing markets in South Asia and Southeast Asia. This is where market opportunity is greater, and this is where newcomers, such as Japan, tend to have the greatest success. Why? Because it's in the developing markets where competitive factors, including price, industrial collaboration and engagement, and fiscal support, it's in these markets where they really are the key factors in decision making. And indeed, these factors can explain the expansion in the past decade of suppliers, including South Korea, Israel, and China, who have all grown their market shares in regional developing markets in the Indo-Pacific. Next slide, please. And on this slide, I want to look at market entry strategies. In terms of export strategies, there's no successful one-size-fits-all approach, unfortunately. But there are a few standout strategies that successful exporters deploy in this part of the world. First of all, what's clear is that in the region's developing markets, where Japan is likely to have greater success, there is no requirement for best-in-class defense equipment. Cheaper, good enough equipment, often with older designs, is usually sufficient to win defense contracts. Second, the most successful exporters to the Indo-Pacific have usually established a strong network of regional contacts across industry, technology, trade, government, and military. This is strengthened through regular engagements, such as councils, dialogues, forums, and these days, webinars. A key word here, though, is regular. Regular engagement and regular discussions with a view to meeting and partnering on regional customers' capability requirements. Supporting this engagement is industrial cooperation, but not just any industrial cooperation. What's important here is that industrial cooperation in terms of an export strategy is both meaningful and strongly promoted within the customer country. Due to COVID-19, self-reliance has become an important political issue in many regional countries, and exporters' engagement with this self-reliant requirement is accordingly an increasingly important aspect of their strategies. It's also the case that the shape of this industrial engagement is changing, especially in the developing markets. COVID-19 is prompting a shift away from technology transfers towards tangible collaboration to support local production and exports. Again, this is to promote self-reliance. Another increasingly important requirement is fiscal aid and loans. Given economic constraints made worse by COVID, most developing countries in the Indo-Pacific are looking to support defense procurement through finances offered by the supplier government. That's especially the case in developing markets. And suppliers that don't offer this are in an inferior position. What's also interesting is that Japan's rivals for defense exports in the Indo-Pacific are adjusting their export policies in response to changing market entry requirements and the need to become more competitive. These changes are aligned with these suppliers' efforts to expand their strategic profile in the Indo-Pacific. Excuse me. So in recent years, defense exporters, including India, South Korea, the UK, Israel, China, and Australia, have all enhanced their defense export policies to strengthen their market entry strategies in terms of government, diplomatic, and defense engagement, industrial partnerships and industrial collaboration, and also in providing financial support for defense sales in the region, i.e., that means providing fiscal loans and credit. One key element of all these defense countries' upgraded defense export policies has been the acknowledgement that defense export strategies need whole of government support from across ministries and government agencies. There's a growing recognition that defense exports to the Indo-Pacific is not just a business of the one defense ministry and one local company. It's important to point out, I think, that whole of government support is now becoming the norm. Next slide, please. So in this last slide, I wanted to highlight a recent defense contract that Japan pursued in one of the Indo-Pacific's biggest defense markets, Indonesia. This provided, I think, some indicators about Japan's bidding strategies for regional opportunities. So Indonesia wanted to buy frigates to replace an aging platform, Japan's 30 FFM class frigate built by Mitsubishi and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was one of 4 contenders for the contract. The other 3 were from Europe. In the end, Italy's Fincantieri's FREM class design was selected for the frigate contract. But actually, all the vessels that competed for the program were quite similar in terms of capability and also the ability to integrate systems. The major differences were in terms of export strategies. The 3 European firms had established a strong partnership with PT PAL, Indonesia's state-owned naval shipbuilder. The 3 European firms also had support from their governments in terms of being able to offer Indonesia export credit and fiscal support. They were also able to offer flexibility in terms of additional capability, technologies, and industrial collaboration, including exports. Japan's position was framed around a defense equipment and technology transfer agreement that was signed with Indonesia in March 2021. In late 2020, Japan's Mitsubishi also held talks with shipbuilding counterparts in Indonesia with the aim to support collaboration on the 30 FFM class. And while all this was positive, Japan's weaknesses were perceived in Indonesia as the restrictions on the technologies that it could offer Indonesia, the lack of export credit to provide finance to Indonesia to support the acquisition, and the generally lower profile that Japan had in terms of industrial collaboration. Notably, Japanese shipbuilders had not announced or promoted partnerships agreements with counterparts in Indonesia. Without being too critical, what this program showed was that Japan probably needs to be more competitive, more assertive, and also more willing to engage with customers in the marketing and the promotion of defense platforms. This competitiveness also extends to Japan's defense export strategy and its ability to assist customers in areas such as local production, supply chain integration, technology transfers, and fiscal support. What's probably missing, in short, is a whole of government strategy. Thank you very much.
今、200人を優に上回る人たち
We
が
have many more than 200 people listening to the presentations now. Mr. John Cravat's presentation hit the nail on the head. It hit the target center on a whole of government approach is necessary. Government loans and other financing measures are needed. And also manufacturers such as Mitsubishi should not have a low profile. They should be more firmly engaged. The market is growing all around Japan and our competitors are not standing still. What should we be doing in that situation? I believe that was the challenge that Mr. Cravat. Kyosuke Matsumoto is our next speaker. He entered what was the defense agency, and since then has worked in many fields. And he is now in an important job that has great influence on policy. The microphone is yours, Mr. Matsumoto. My name is Matsumoto from ATLA. I'm happy to be with you today. Now, may I have the slides on the screen, please? Now, I will be talking. Last time, Assistant Commissioner Kasugahara talked about international equipment and technology cooperation overall. So I thought I wouldn't have much to add. But I was asked to once again talk about international cooperation. And so I thought I would try to have a narrower focus than Assistant Commissioner Kasugahara had last time. So when one thinks about an Indo-Pacific regional strategy, we must be thinking about the center and the core. It always has to be the US-Japan relationship. So I'll be talking about that first. Next slide, please. So, as I just said, the US-Japan relationship is the core for promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific region, and equipment and technology is important there. And I have four focus areas here: strengthening alliance capabilities in the region, strengthening common production and maintenance spaces, building a robust supply chain, and strengthening cooperation frameworks. Next slide, please. So I think that we have to think about how to make this region a peaceful and stable one. And so one of the big premises is strengthening the US-Japan alliances. From the perspective of deterrence and presence, I think that this is really the most important area. And what backs this up? It's defense capability. And we have relied on the US in a lot of areas, especially for many different types of very advanced technology: F-35A, F-35B, Aegis, V-22, PAC-3 MSC, E-2D, Global Hawk, etc. Very advanced capabilities. And we have been operating them, and that is a very important form of cooperation, we believe. In addition, co-development and co-production of defense equipment is something that we're doing, and the SM3 Block 2A corresponds to that. But when one thinks about future equipment and technology cooperation, we need to continue looking for more areas for cooperation. This is an issue for both the US and Japan. We do have some collaborative research programs. There are 7 listed on this slide. They have not yet reached development or production, but they are focused on the most advanced technology, and the US and Japan are doing collaborative research to try to improve each other's capabilities, and that's very important. Next slide, please. In terms of supporting the alliance capability, we need to be able to support the US as it operates in our region. And we are creating a common maintenance space for the for equipment that both the US and Japan have, such as the Osprey, the F-35. Probably be useful to have maintenance facilities in our region. There are also parts that are out of production in the US, and they can be produced in Japan and then be exported back to the United States. And we can, in this way, support the US in its defense equipment structure. And then a regional maintenance posture is also helpful to the United States. We would like for Japanese companies to be able to provide maintenance services to the US. And we do have some examples such as NIPI and MHI that are maintaining US ships and airplanes. We think that there's a need to increase this kind of thing. Next slide, please.
それからあと最近の議題ではですね、やっぱり
Recently, a topic that comes up often is looking at the supply chain overall. We have to look at it overall. And how can we strengthen Japan's supply chain and the US's supply chain? This is an ongoing dialogue between defense authorities. So the US is studying its supply chain and Japan is studying our supply chain. And the concepts are similar, but what is common is that we have to identify our vulnerabilities and then think about countermeasures. And what we have to think about is that it's very difficult to overcome vulnerabilities on one's own. So international collaboration, especially allies and friends, can complement each other. And we believe this is necessary. Next slide, please.
日米間の装備技術協力
Between Japan and the US, there are many, many things that we can do on equipment cooperation. There's a framework called the SNTF. The Department of Defense in the US divided ANS and R&E, but we have to strengthen our ties with R&E, especially for cutting edge technology. That's one issue for us. Also, we purchase quite a bit of US made equipment. If you look at the totals, I think we're in the top 5 in the world. In spite of that, to be honest, between Japan and the US, what kind of equipment related exchanges are happening? What kind of framework do we have? If you compare what the US has with NATO, Japan really doesn't have well-developed frameworks. There are various kinds of frameworks that provide mutual exemptions and so forth. There's one thing that's listed here, that's RDP MOU. It was concluded in 2016 to give mutual exemptions to Buy American and Buy Japanese laws. And there are other examples written here. We think that we need to make progress on these frameworks so that it will be easier to cooperate in equipment and technology. Next slide, please.
以上が日米なんですけれども、
So I've talked about Japan and the US. I talked about it first because it really is a relationship that's on a different level, but we also have equipment and technology cooperation with Indo-Pacific nations. The perspective is different. It is a means of engaging in defense cooperation for peace and stability in the region. There are 3 areas of focus I will touch on. Strengthening efforts with Australia and India, capacity building, and then future strategies, including the need for a Japan version of FMS. Next slide, please. As to strengthening work with Australia and India, we had equipment and technology agreements with Australia at an early stage and have cooperated at various levels, including joint research. And India was the second fastest, perhaps. We have also done joint research with them. And we are strengthening our bilateral relations with both Australia and India. We have not transferred equipment. We have discussed candidate technologies, but we have no track record yet. Equipment transfer relates to timings and requirements. It's not something that happens easily. Also, on the supply chain, there are likely areas where we can complement one another. Within the Quad, we think that this should be an item of discussion. Next slide, please. Other than Australia and India, these are mostly Southeast Asian nations. We engage in capacity building. And the list of support here shows various soft projects that we have done, such as humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, diving medicine seminars, and other such soft projects. Next page, please. It's difficult for us to engage in hard equipment and technology transfer. Last time, Assistant Commissioner Kasagahara mentioned this, but we do have examples of having done this with the TC-90 trainers and UH-1 parts to the Philippines, which were transferred at no cost. And then in August of last year, we sold radars. Also, we are engaged in a lot of different discussions with different countries, but we have no other contracts. Earlier in John's presentation, there was talk of the Indonesian frigate. No, we cannot get into specifics here about our relations with Indonesia, but we are aware of the Fincantieri announcement. But I would just note that there has not yet been an announcement from the government of Indonesia. We have a very close dialogue with the government of Indonesia, and equipment and technology cooperation and the possibility of that is part of our discussion. We have not abandoned hope for various possibilities. Next slide, please. Earlier in John's presentation, equipment and technology cooperation, equipment transfer, especially to Asian countries, is difficult. Perhaps Japan ought to create something like an FMS system. People say this from time to time. The first point would be that FMS is a system that is unique to the United States. Looking around the world, there's only one country that has such a system, and that's the US. and it is the embodiment of the US's security and foreign policy, and they have built it up in that way. Operating in Southeast Asia, there would be corporate risk. Who would bear it? That would be one issue for us. FMS, I think, is made up of many parts. We should perhaps analyze it to see which parts of it we need. I think that we and the government should have a dialogue with our industry on this. Even looking at the market, as we heard in John's presentation, if you look at the pie chart here, it's similar to what we saw earlier. The markets that look promising for business look to be the US and Europe. We might be vendors here, but in Southeast Asia, it would be more government policy than business that would be the driving factor, or security policy. So I think that the government and the private sector should continue to cooperate to try to make sales efforts. And there could be measures to give tax exemptions or to bear downgrade cost. As I said, FMS should be analyzed into its parts to see what we need to focus on, and we'll continue that discussion. That concludes my presentation.
Director
Matsumoto, thank you so much.
素晴らしい翻訳を、ポール・ハーシーさんしていただきてありがとうございます。
We're grateful to Paul Hersey for his interpretation.
それでは続きまして、防衛研究所の専門家でいらっしゃる高橋。
Next, Sugio Takahashi from NIDS. Sorry to have kept you waiting. He will be our next speaker. We've got a lot of questions. I was going to say this at the end, but we're thinking of creating a new function like a chat room. We will be ending the discussion at 10 p.m. Japan time, but that won't be the end of it. No, you don't have to cram in the questions during the webinar. We will be opening up this new function later. Mr. Takahashi, go ahead. Can you all hear me? Yes, we can. I'm Takahashi from NIDS, the National Institute for Defense Studies. I'll be talking about equipment cooperation, but we have the market and business perspective and the policy perspective. We had two very good presentations from Mr. Gavat and Mr. Matsumoto. I'll be talking about it from a strategic perspective. Next slide, please. For the past 20, 30 years, China has been quickly expanding its military capabilities based on explosive economic growth. These pie charts show East Asia and their share of defense expenditures. China, Japan, the ROK, and Taiwan. We don't have enough data for North Korea. And this is from the Institute for International Strategic Studies Military Balance in the UK. And you can see that it's roughly 40% for Japan and 11% for the ROK and a little less for Taiwan. And Japan has held its spending roughly steady at 5 trillion yen, but the ROK has increased its spending, and China is all the way up to 68%, and Japan is down to 17%, and Korea has grown to 14%, and Taiwan has gone down to 5%. So as you can see over these 20 years, the defense balance has changed greatly in our region, and that is the situation that we have today. And when it comes to China, there are several security issues that we face. Japan has the East China Sea, specifically the Senkaku Islands, and the definition of the demarcation of the EEZ. Taiwan has concerns about a crisis. In the South China Sea, China has quickly and unilaterally built artificial islands and has been militarizing them, and this remains a concern. Next slide, please. China has built artificial islands and had other unilateral actions, especially in the South China Sea. I'll be focusing on the South China Sea. Such actions, it's hard to imagine that they would just go away. More military presence, more artificial island building, and starting air defense operations without declaring an air defense identification zone, or ADIZ. This is something that could happen again. We could have more of this. And so I've built a tree of possibilities. One possibility would be that the US and allies would respond. And vis-a-vis that, what would China? They might have restraint, but I don't think there's much chance of that. They, I think, could take even more actions. In that case, to maintain the regional balance of power, we need more and more cooperation from the US. If China showed restraint, we would have relative stability. We have to be careful here. What if the US does not respond? Then the various countries of the region could join China in a kind of bandwagon. So Japan, Australia, and the US are not parties to the conflicts in the South China Sea. And so we have to be able to support them. They have to feel that they are being supported. I think it's important to provide them with such support, such that they have such an awareness. For example, Philippines, Vietnam, if they accept China's claims, they would fall under China's orbit. Next slide, please. This is just a map, but it basically means that if the Philippines or Vietnam or Indonesia were to give in to Chinese pressure, then the balance of power in the South China Sea would move more toward the Philippines, and Guam would become the front. And the geopolitical, geostrategic environment would completely change. This is going to touch on what I said earlier, but US, Japan, Australia, looking at the South China Sea's issues, we are not direct parties to these problems. What's important is that the countries of the region believe that we are supporting them. They feel that we are supporting them. Next slide, please. What policy options are there? There's a bit of overlap, but I've listed 3. The US has military presence in the South China Sea, and something that can really be important in terms of giving the countries of the region a feeling that they're being supported. But this is theoretically possible for Japan, but it's difficult, realistically speaking. So what can we do? And this overlaps a bit: capacity building support and defense equipment cooperation. And we had a very detailed presentation from Mr. Matsumoto about capacity building that's already taking place. And outside of defense equipment, we also have cooperation on maritime policing. And I don't know if we need to separate capacity building and defense equipment cooperation, but both of them increase the capacities of Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore. They should feel that they're being supported by the US and the US's allies. And defense equipment cooperation can do this as a matter of policy, as Mr. Matsumoto has outlined. I think that it has an important strategic significance in that regard. In the South China Sea, to maintain the status quo, defense equipment cooperation can be very important strategically, I believe. And this will be very important in terms of determining the future of this region. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Takashi, for your detailed presentation that clearly explained the situation. As to how we proceed, John Grafat and the two Japanese officials, one in ATLA and the other in a research body. We heard about the growing market from Mr. Grafat, about many competitors, and the necessity of a whole of government approach and the centrality of finance. Is there anything you would like to ask Mr. Grafat? This is a good chance for you to frankly ask him questions. Good, if I may. Yes. Who was this? Mr. Takahashi. Go ahead. Do we need to wait for interpreting?
Go
right ahead. I do have one question for Mr. Grafat. So, especially vis-a-vis Southeast Asia, if Japan wants to do defense equipment cooperation, I think the strategic background is so important. But we do have competitors from Europe. For example, depending on the equipment, it could also be the Republic of Korea. What kind of motivation are the competitors doing business? Is it just for purely economic reasons, do you think? Or are competitors also focused on the strategic aspect, do you think?
Thanks for the question. Indeed, I think you have to say that the strategic aspect is increasingly important. We've seen just in the last year, countries such as the UK, Germany declare a requirement to grow their strategic profile in the Indo-Pacific because they're aware that this part of the world will be a strategically, economically important region in the world over the coming decades. And so a way of strengthening their strategic profile is to secure defense contracts, defense export contracts with some regional some regional countries. And we've seen, with the AUKUS announcement recently, with Australia's decision to buy submarines, that this region will become strategically even more important than it is now, and that will even increase the rivalry for defense contracts, which means that Japan is under increasing pressure to expand its own profile in the region because the competition is growing very fast.
ありがとうございました。高橋さんの問いの中には、
Thank you very much. In your question, Mr. Takahashi, might there not be countries that are just doing it for the money, that don't have a strategic interests? I think that was one of the implications. What would your answer be to that, Mr. Kavat?
Well, the money is still an important part. All these companies, certainly in the West, they all have shareholders and they all need to make profits. So the money is important, no doubt about it. But as I've said, the strategic aspect of it is becoming increasingly important, and indeed that strategic aspect is underpinning the growing trend in ensuring that exporters have a whole of government approach, because they're aware that it's not just a financial thing. They're aware that there is growing competition, and the exporters are aware that the exports to the region are strategically important. Just look at China as well for a second. China has done very well in exports in the past decade into the Indo-Pacific, and that's despite the fact that China is motivating some of that trade. But China's defense sales to the Indo-Pacific are certainly not driven by finances. Indeed, many exports that China secures are supported fully by Beijing in terms of finances. So that means that China's exports to the region are wholly driven by strategic issues. Finance doesn't come into it, and that kind of even that even highlights even more the requirement for Japan to become more competitive in its approach, certainly in terms of providing fiscal support for regional customers.
はい。この点について松本さん、高橋さんはどう思われるかということは、やはり伺ってみたい。
Right. I'd like to ask Mr. Matsumoto and Mr. Takahashi what they think about a whole of government approach and about overall approaches that include the strategic consideration. What does Japan have to do to get there? Either of you, Mr. Matsumoto, Mr. Takahashi? I believe you're on mute. Right, so we have the very same understanding of the problem, and we are negotiating with various governments, and various requirements arise, such as for local content. Just the Ministry of Defense cannot answer such requirements. And thus, we are in touch with various other ministries for finance, JVIC, and export authorities. And there's a very positive discussion underway. And a large part of this in Japan is NFS, but the government as a whole must cooperate. This is something that we are in the process of searching for. For example, let's say METI might want to have an item transferred, and there might be a separate negotiation elsewhere. We're talking about combining such efforts, even now. We haven't succeeded in realizing this, but the direction in which we are headed is exactly that. Also, when it comes to corporate risk, how can we take measures to reduce the burden of risk on companies doing business in, for instance, Southeast Asia? We should really be thinking about creating some kind of a system for that, we believe. Thank you, Mr. Matsumoto. We have a lot of questions. I would love to answer them individually, but Mr. Matsumoto's response now was very important. Unfortunately, Japan is often said to only be able to proceed with baby steps. But if you think about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was no such a discussion happening at all. And so what we just heard was really a very innovative idea for Japan. How do we reduce risk for companies? This came up in Mr. John Graffat's. Companies are low profile. They're like children. They hide in their mother's skirts. If that's the case, they can't get business. But even the largest contractors only rely on defense business for a very small percent of their overall business. And therefore, they have the dilemma that the risk that they take has to be proportionate. And I think that the government might have a role to play. We might have to be a bit creative. Now, Mr. Takahashi, as an observer, do you have any opinion on this? Well, I would say that in one company, the civilian business is much greater than the military business any particular company might engage in. This is a characteristic of Japanese defense industry. But it also means that it's easy to use dual-use technology. How should I say this? If you look at the company as a whole, the Ministry of Defense is a big single customer. And as Mr. Matsumoto said, and as you just said, Mr. Taniguchi, risk management, like recently we've heard about AUKUS and the change of decision for submarines in Austria. This is a risk that can't be avoided in the defense business. And so it's difficult to make progress if the companies have to bear all of that risk. That's certain. So I think that some kind of a scheme or a system, I believe that the Japanese bureaucracy should be very good at creating such a system once the direction is set. It appears that perhaps we have lost Mr. Takahashi's audio. Mr. Matsumoto, would you have something to add? We have several questions that are rather technical that have to do with FMS. You might want to respond to those as well. Very well. I would say on FMS, if we are considering a government-to-government contract, that's one of the main characteristics of FMS. The government buys defense equipment from a company and then sells it to a foreign government. Now, there's the issue of whether Japan could do that. In order to do that, a lot of financial support measures are necessary, and a kind of a fund is needed. The US has what they call a trust fund. Partner countries have to pay in advance, and then the funds move into that trust fund. Would such a system work for Southeast Asia? Would they be able to pay in advance? Would we be able to supplement that with financing? We have to be thinking about these kinds of systems. And in order to build such a system, as I touched on a bit, the policy of the government has to be made clear. We have to make our intentions clear, because this would be our security strategy for the Indo-Pacific region. Without making this clear, then taking risk reduction financial measures, I think, would be hard. So what comes first is to make that kind of thinking clear in the government and to express it. Mr. Matsumoto, you've just made a very important remark, and our audience may be aware, but Japanese companies in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and even up until today, hate being called merchants of death. And listening to Mr. Gravatt, military budgets in the Asia-Pacific region are increasing, and someone is going to be providing those military services and military equipment. And is that going to be a country that is not friendly to Japan? Then for Japan to fulfill that demand would not at all be being a merchant of death, but rather to contribute to stability. And then if the government were more clear about this, then it would be easier for companies to deal with their reputation risk. Now, Mr. Gravatt is very well familiar with Japan's particular situation. Can we get some comments about from you about what we've just been discussing?
Yes, I think Japan is in a strong position when it comes to conventional military equipment already, and certainly the ability, if Japan put its weight behind an export strategy, its ability to be very competitive in developing markets where a country like China is already very competitive. Japan is in a strong position, and it would make good sense for Japan to really put a weight behind efforts to win contracts, for example, in places where China is increasingly successful, such as Indonesia, such as Malaysia, and Thailand. But I also want to make another point that Mr. Takahashi made, which was about Japan's strength as a dual application technology developer. What we're seeing across the region, and most of the time today, we've been talking about conventional military systems, frigates and aircraft. But I think what we're seeing and what we will see over the next 10 years is increased focus on non-conventional systems, non-conventional technologies, dual use technologies. artificial intelligence, cyber, all these data analytics, all these technologies are being born in the commercial domains, and it puts Japan in a very strong position to support regional countries when they're looking to develop these technologies and these capabilities. And for Japan, which has strong IP in these areas, it won't be a major risk, because the developing countries are looking for capabilities that are not at the same level that Japan already has. So it's IP that's lower down the chain. And so this is a great area, I think, for companies like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to really engage with some of the requirements that are developing in places like Indonesia, places like India, where they are looking to develop these modern capabilities, modern technologies that are born from the commercial side, and it puts Japan in a very strong position. If you add that strong position, if you couple that strong position with a strong government support, it makes a very compelling package, I think. And Japan has to work at that in order to see those opportunities, and then to put in position a strategy that can win those contracts. And it may not be big contracts for things like artificial intelligence and things like that, but it's a start, and it's a start in places like India, where Japan hasn't been that successful to date.
なるほど。コンベンショナルなものというだけではなく、これか
I
らの
see. So not just conventional items, but future possibilities for cooperation as well. I see. Now, on Indonesia, Mr. Matsumoto, Mr. Takahashi, as members of the government, it might be difficult for you to comment, but if I were to give a footnote, now, the Japan rather, has consistently given the most amount of overseas development assistance to Indonesia. So Japan should have had a lot of leverage on Indonesia, but unfortunately, for high-speed rail and other infrastructure, for defense contracts, Japan has not been able, unfortunately, to make good use of that leverage. And finance packages are also necessary for infrastructure projects. Should we call this the bundling of financing and other projects? Without this, it's really hard to get the sale. We would really like to see our government get an overall approach to get the power to get it done. And the governments have to be stable too. We have to be able to get out of this cycle where we have a government that lasts only a year. The Kishida government is facing an election on the 31st, and then in the upper house in July. And it might not be the case that the elections cause a great difference in direction, but we hope that the government will be very strong, and that they will succeed in creating a whole of government approach. And I hope that you will advocate for that to higher authorities in the government. We have so many comments. It's really hard for us to respond to each of them individually. India has a very large budget. This has been pointed out. The more I see, perhaps you all are more frustrated hearing this. Japan has so much capability. Why isn't it succeeding more? But I think that this can be a reason for hope. We can do more. As to China's approach, we have some very tough comments. that many, I'm sure, would agree with. We have had a very deep discussion here for over an hour and about 10 minutes. And we're grateful to our team of 2 interpreters. And this is not the end of discussion. We are creating a new chat function that will be able to handle Q&A on our website. So for defense contractors, defense contracts, defense cooperation, other issues between Japan and like-minded countries, we hope that this will be a good place for dialogue and a place that could positively influence public opinion and the government's policy. So we would like to be closing for today, but I will give each speaker a minute. Mr. Takahashi, then Mr. Matsumoto, and then finally Mr. Gravad. 1 minute apiece. Mr. Takahashi, you have the floor. Thank you. Can you hear me again? Yes, we can. I'm sorry that my connection dropped earlier. I think the main point for today's discussion is that Japan needs to think about strategy. 10 years ago, before the second Abe administration, there was always the excuse that we couldn't do things. We can do more now. So now that we can, we have to think about why and how we make it succeed. And we have to think about this in light of our regional strategy and our global strategy and our security policy. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Matsumoto. Thank you. Today, we had a very good discussion. We at ATLA have so much that we must do. And it's hard for us to keep up with everything that we should be doing. And we want to, one of our main focuses of activity is to promote transfer overseas based on policy. Our own technological capability needs to be strengthened. Without that, then it's hard to transfer overseas. And it's also necessary for our own security. So advanced technology, we must be making efforts to introduce more and more advanced technology. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Matsumoto. Finally, John Gravad.
Thank you. Yeah, the last comment really is to highlight, I think, where Japan has come in the last few years, and really to say, you know, it's only a year ago that Japan won its first major contract, the FPS radars to the Philippines, which was its first major kind of platform sale. And that was achieved against competition. And that really is a line in the sand to say, you know, Japan can do it. Japan can be successful in some of these developing markets with the right strategy, with the right product, with the right cost, and in right industrial collaboration. I think that there is potential for Japan to do a lot more. Another thing that we haven't really touched on today, but I think is an important point for Japan going forward, is the possibility of entering deeper collaboration programs, as we've seen with AUKUS recently. There's a real appetite for collaboration in the Indo-Pacific at the moment, and this is another strong kind of route to market that Japan needs to focus on with strategic allies in the region. So Japan is in a strong position. Make no doubt, it's in a strong position to grow its defense profile, defense export profile, but it needs to adjust and adapt a few strategies and be more confident and be more willing to engage perhaps with its customers. Thank you.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。大変、ポジティブなノートを頂戴したと思います。
Thank you very much for that very positive note upon which we shall end. As I have been telling you, ISIC-Japan.org/ISI Connect is going to be our discussion platform. Thank you so much. We appreciate all of your questions and comments. We were not able to answer them all. Sorry for not being a perfect moderator in that sense. See you next time. Thank you.